Our final presenter in this session is Dr. Jim Morris. Dr. Jim Morris is a distinguished professor emeritus of biological and marine sciences at the University of South Carolina. He's also the former director of the Baruch Institute for Marine and Coastal Sciences and a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Dr. Morris has a long history of National Science Foundation funded research at North Inlet, South Carolina, on the effects of changing sea level on coastal wetlands. His discovery of a stabilizing feedback between marsh primary production, vertical marsh accretion, and sea level rise has had a significant impact on the fields of biogeomorphology and marsh ecology. And today, Dr. Morris will be telling us about some implications of the mangrove migration into saltmarsh habitat and what that means for the resilience to sea level rise. So Dr. Morris, I will hand it off to you.
All righty. Okay. It's not advancing. There we go. Okay. Thanks, Abby. I'm going to walk you through some of the results of the marsh equilibrium model applied to Spartina and Avicennia in northern Florida. A good model is parsimonious, and it gives you novel and interesting insights. Now, why is this not advancing for me? There. Do I have to tell you to advance, Abby? Or is it?
I can advance for you if you would like, if you just like to tell me next slide.
Yeah, this is just not working like it did the other day when we had our little run through. Okay.
No worries.
MIM was founded on well-known generalities, and what we hope is that the outputs will give us novel generalities. The first of these generalities, and I think the most important, is an example here of Shelford's law of tolerance. So the plants that grow within the intertidal zone have a limited vertical range in which they will survive. There's an elevation that's too high, it's too dry, osmotic stress gets them. There's an elevation that's too low, and hypoxia gets them, and there's a sweet spot in the middle. You can measure this response with bioassays, shown here, or you can measure them in the field with on-the-ground surveys of biomass in conjunction with RTK measurements or a good digital elevation model. The second generality is that mineral sedimentation rate is proportional to the depth of water flooding the surface of the marsh, the time flooded, and the concentration of mineral sediment in the water column. Thirdly, plants produce roots in proportion to the biomass of leaves. That's known as the functional balance model. And fourthly, the decay of organic matter in anoxic soils is incomplete. Some organic compounds, namely lignin, are refractory. That's why peat forms in wetlands. The basic mathematics that describe these generalities is pretty simple. Putting them together in a framework that solves a bigger problem is what MIM does. The math is simple, but quantifying the generalities is where the hard work is required, and my colleagues are entirely responsible for the parameterization of the mangrove part of this model. And the next slide. Okay. Yeah, so I had to add tree growth to this marsh model to simulate mangrove growth and accretion. And this is an example of the user interface. It's designed to be fairly simple. The inputs are fairly simple. I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but the physical inputs are simple. Thank you. The biological inputs range from easy to fairly difficult, and the inputs, the parameters, that is, are something, you know, the model is more sensitive and less sensitive to certain parameters, which is also an interesting thing. Now, this is an example of a run of, this is a marsh simulation of North Inlet. And the figure on the top left here is that is the growth curve, and the figure right under it is a time series plot of the simulated biomass. And so in this example, where the rate of sea level rise is 40 centimeters over 100 years, this marsh is fairly stable. The biomass is stable. This plot in the middle on the lower panel is of the rate of, it is of the sea level and the marsh elevation. So the marsh is losing a little bit of elevation, but it does nicely over 100 years. Next slide is I wish I could do this, simulation of Abyssinia growth in northern Florida. And this little top figure on the left shows the growth curves of the juveniles. That's the blue parabola here, and of the mature trees, and that's the green parabola. And the red line shows the course of biomass and elevation over the course of 100 years. And so this simulation starts off with juvenile trees having a biomass of 500 grams per meter square at 45 centimeters. Over 30 years, as they mature, the biomass increases and the elevation increases. Now, this is also the sea level rise is 40 centimeters over 100 years. That's not very much. These trees have the capacity to increase their elevation by virtue of the organic matter that they add to the soil. And so over the course of 30 years, they really add a lot of biomass, and they add a lot of elevation through soil organic matter accretion. And they do fine. 40 centimeters is not a problem for these trees. Next slide. I'm going to take you through several simulations of different rates of sea level rise in the marshes and in the mangroves. And this one is a simulation of the marshes at GTM at 3 different rates of sea level rise: 40 centimeters in 100 years, 80, and 100. And the biomass starts off at about 1,200 grams per meter square at an elevation of 45 centimeters. And at a 40 centimeter rise, the biomass is fairly stable over 100 years. The marsh loses a little bit of relative elevation, but the fate of the 80 centimeter and 100 centimeter plants is that they crash and burn before the century is out. So the middle figure shows you the time series of relative elevations in these simulations, and the figure on the right shows the biomass plotted against the relative elevation over 100 years. And so you, in C, panel C, you start off here at where it says start. That's where the simulations start. The 40 centimeter doesn't move far from that starting point. It remains right up there. Whereas you can see the 80 and the 100s, they migrate down this curve and crash. And the next slide shows the simulations of pioneer Abyssinia. So they start off at 500 grams per meter square. They start off at an elevation of about 45 centimeters. In the case of the 40 centimeter sea level simulation, the biomass just increases continuously, and it also does the same in the 80 centimeter. The 100 centimeter simulation, the biomass peaks and then begins to decline rather precipitously. And when the mangroves collapse, they collapse in a spectacular fashion. That's because of all the labile organic matter that's in the soil. When the trees die, all that labile organic matter goes away fairly quickly, and the elevation drops fairly quickly. The middle panel shows the time course of elevations, and you can see over the first 30 years, they add elevation. They add a lot of relative elevation. Now remember, sea level is rising at the same time. So these trees are gaining elevation at a rate early on that exceeds the rate of sea level rise by quite a bit. And you can see what happens in the case of the 100 centimeter, the red dashed line here, the elevation starts to decline relatively quickly. And the figure on the right is really a lot of fun. Shows the dotted lines show the growth curves of the juvenile and mature trees. They all three simulations start off at the same point. They all gain elevation and biomass during the first 30 years. And in the case of the 100 centimeter sea level rise, they add biomass. They reach the optimum and then exceed it, and they start to decline. And in the next slide, I think we're doing okay. 5 minutes, okay. Next slide. Oh no, sorry, go back one. Okay, this is the case of the fate of mature trees. So they start off. Let's look at C, because this is kind of fun. They start off here near the optimum, and in the case of the 40 centimeter rise, they just increase their elevation, and that decreases the biomass. They basically grow themselves out of the sweet spot. In the case of the 80 and the 100, they first increase elevation, and then as the acceleration increases, they retreat. It starts going back. And in the case of the 100, they end up where they start. And in the next slide shows, in the table here are the rates of sea level rise at different points in time, 25, 50 to 100 100 years in the simulation, at different assumed endpoints of sea level. So, for example, in the case of the 100 centimeter sea level rise, by the end of the century, the rate of sea level rise is actually going to be 18 millimeters a year, which is pretty high. Now, the figure over here on the right shows the survival time of pioneer trees started at either 45 or 55 centimeters at constant rates of sea level rise. And the red line here is the 30-year time to maturity. And note that the survival of the trees at 45 centimeters is quite limited. And when you exceed a rate of sea level rise of about 17 millimeters a year, they will not mature. The 55 centimeter trees, they will survive to maturity by virtue of their increased elevation capital. And then I'm going to leave you with some conclusions in the next slide. So the sequestration of organic matter is variable, and it depends on the rate of sea level rise. It depends on plant biology, age, community composition, and so on. Mangroves have higher rates of vertical accretion than salt marshes by virtue of their increased production of organic matter. And I would posit that the ecosystem service value of mangroves is greater than salt marshes. It pains me to say that, but I think that's true. Mature mangroves are more resilient than young mangroves. They have a significant head start that endows them with greater vertical accretion rates. The limiting factor for northern migration is seedling transport, while maturation rate will limit northern migration and inland transgression when rates of sea level rise are high. Young mangroves must outgrow rising sea level, both for transgression and migration. And when mangroves drown, they do so with significant loss of elevation due to a large volume of labile organic matter and roots in their soil. And the implications of this are kind of interesting. I think mangrove coasts will change episodically. Salt marshes, on the other hand, I think will transgress gradually. And that'll be a big difference between mangrove landscapes and salt marshes going forward, I think. And I'll stop there, and thanks for your attention. Thank you, Adam. Adam loves figure 2, panel C.
Thanks, Dr. Morris. We have time for a couple of questions. Adam asks, does this mean there are some places where we shouldn't even try to plant young mangroves?
Oh, yeah. So one of the interesting questions that's come out of this, I think, is whether we should proactively transplant mangroves further north. There's some empirical evidence that they will survive farther north than their current limits. So they're currently limited probably by seedling transport. I'm not saying that, episodic freezes don't knock them back. They do, but if I forgot the question. I'm sorry. What was the question? Should we proactively? No, I don't think it means that we shouldn't proactively plant them. And the sooner we do so, I would say the better. If we wait until the rate of sea level rise is really, really too high, then it's too late.
Yeah. Awesome, thank you. We have another question. When do you think we'll see mangroves in Charleston? And this is from Stephanie Robinson, who is based in Charleston, South Carolina.
You know what? I think we'll see mangroves in Charleston as soon as someone has enough courage to plant them there. And it won't be me. No.
Thank you.